Michael and Emily had always been inseparable. They met in college, and from the very first day, it felt like destiny had brought them together. Their love story was the kind you read about in books, perfect in every way. Emily, with her warm smile and kind heart, complemented Michael's calm and steady personality. They fit together like two pieces of a puzzle. They graduated together, traveled the world, and soon after, they got married. Their love grew stronger with every passing year. Michael knew that Emily was the one, and she knew he was the one for her. They had built a life together, one full of dreams and plans for the future. The one thing that was missing was a child. So when they found out they were expecting, they couldn't have been more thrilled. Their dream of starting a family was finally coming true. As Emily's pregnancy progressed, their excitement only grew. The couple spent countless hours preparing for the arrival of their baby. The nursery was painted, the crib assembled, and every little detail was carefully planned. Emily, glowing with pregnancy, would often joke that she couldn't wait to hold their little boy in her arms. Michael would smile, his heart swelling with love and anticipation. He would rub her belly gently, talking to the baby, and imagining what their son would be like. 8 months into her pregnancy, Emily's health began to change. She felt more tired than usual and had some mild pain, but she brushed it off, saying it was just part of being so close to giving birth. Michael, always concerned, insisted she go to the doctor to get checked out, but Emily would laugh it off and say there was nothing to worry about. She reassured him that everything would be fine. One evening, Michael came home after a long day of work and found Emily in bed, looking pale and exhausted. Her hands were shaking slightly as she tried to read a book, but the tiredness was clear on her face. Michael, growing more worried by the second, asked her if she needed to go to the hospital. Emily smiled weakly and said, "I'm fine, Michael. Just a little tired. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The next morning, Michael woke up to find Emily in severe pain. Her breathing was fast, and she seemed confused. Terrified, he rushed her to the hospital. They didn't have time to waste. The doctors worked quickly, trying to figure out what was going on. Emily's condition worsened by the minute, and Michael stood there, helpless, not knowing what to do. Hours passed, and Michael's world came crashing down around him. Doctors informed him that there was nothing they could do. Emily's body couldn't handle the strain of the pregnancy, and both she and their baby boy had passed away during the night. Michael's heart shattered into a million pieces. How could this happen? How could something so awful happen to the woman he loved and to their unborn child? The loss was unbearable. Michael couldn't comprehend the emptiness he felt. The hospital was full of people going about their day, and yet for him, the world had stopped. He didn't want to leave, didn't want to accept that his life had just changed forever. Emily had been his everything, and now she was gone. The funeral was a blur. It felt like a dream, like something that wasn't really happening. Family and friends came to say their goodbyes, but nothing could fill the empty space left behind. Michael held on to the memories of Emily, of their love, of their dreams for the future, but it wasn't enough. The hole in his heart was too big, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he would never be whole again. He spent the days that followed in a daze, going through the motions of life without her. But every day, he visited her grave. Every day, he talked to her as if she could still hear him. He would tell her how much he missed her, how much he wished things could have been different. The pain never eased, and every step he took felt like walking through thick fog. Nothing felt right anymore. And so, Michael's life continued in a quiet sadness, with Emily's memory always in the background. But little did he know, the most shocking moment of his life was yet to come, one that would forever change the way he saw everything. The days after Emily's death blurred together for Michael. He felt like he was moving through life in a fog, going through the motions but never truly living. The house they had shared felt too quiet. The nursery, once full of excitement and joy, was now a painful reminder of the future they would never have. Michael couldn't bring himself to remove any of Emily's things. Her clothes still hung in the closet, and her books still sat on the shelf. Her scent lingered in the air, and it felt as though she had only stepped out for a moment. Every morning, he would wake up and stare at the empty side of the bed, the weight of her absence pressing down on him. He missed the way she laughed, the way she always knew how to make him feel better, even on his worst days. Now, there was only silence. The emptiness around him seemed to grow with each passing hour. Michael tried to stay busy. He went to work, but the tasks that once excited him now felt meaningless. The conversations with coworkers were hollow, and the laughter in the office sounded distant and unimportant. He couldn't focus. All he could think about was Emily and the life they had planned together. His mind kept replaying the day she had passed, the images of the hospital, and the doctor's cold words echoing in his ears. "There's nothing we can do." It was a sentence that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. But despite the overwhelming sadness, Michael did his best to honor Emily's memory. He visited her grave every day. The cemetery, located on a quiet hill just outside the city, became his second home. He would sit by her grave for hours, talking to her as if she were still there. He would tell her about his day, how much he missed her, and how much he wished she could have seen their baby boy. It was a one-sided conversation, but somehow it made him feel closer to her. He would bring flowers, her favorite lilies, and place them gently on her grave, each time hoping that somehow she would know how much he loved her. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Michael's grief never seemed to lessen. It was as though a part of him had been ripped away, and nothing could fill the void left behind. One cold evening, after another long day of work, Michael found himself heading to the cemetery again. It had been 8 months since Emily's death, and he had yet to feel any sense of peace. The weight of his grief still hung over him like a heavy cloud. As he approached the cemetery gates, he noticed something strange. There were no other cars in the lot, and the air felt unusually still. It was almost as if the world had gone silent. He parked his car and walked toward the graveyard. The crunch of gravel under his shoes, the only sound in the quiet night. The moon was high in the sky, casting a soft glow over the rows of graves. Michael reached the spot where Emily was buried and paused, his heart aching. But then something caught his eye. Fresh flowers had been placed on Emily's grave. It was unusual because he always brought his own flowers, and no one else ever visited at this time of night. He bent down to get a closer look, and his breath caught in his throat. The flowers were beautiful, bright yellow daisies, her favorite. But there was something else. A small note was tucked underneath them. Curious and confused, Michael carefully picked up the note. It was handwritten in delicate, flowing script. The words were simple but startling. "You are not alone." His hand shook as he read the note again, trying to make sense of it. Who would have left this? And why? He had never seen anyone else visit Emily's grave, let alone leave flowers and a note. Michael's heart raced. He looked around, but the cemetery remained eerily quiet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had the strange feeling that someone was watching him. The silence pressed in around him, and for a moment he felt as though the world had paused. He glanced at the note again. "You are not alone." The words echoed in his mind, and he felt a strange mixture of hope and confusion. What did it mean? Who was leaving these mysterious messages, and why? It was then that Michael heard a faint sound in the distance. Footsteps, quiet but deliberate. He turned quickly, but no one was there. His heart pounded in his chest. Someone had to be out there. Someone was watching. Michael's mind raced. Who would leave a message like this, especially at a grave like Emily's? And why had they left it in the middle of the night? With his pulse racing, he stayed close to Emily's grave, unsure of what to do next. The mystery was just beginning to unfold, and he knew he had to uncover the truth. The next few days, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching him. He couldn't stop thinking about the note. Who had left it? And why? The days after Michael found the note, his mind was filled with questions. Who would leave such a cryptic message at Emily's grave? "You are not alone." The words felt like a puzzle, and Michael couldn't help but wonder what they meant. He returned to the cemetery every day, hoping to find some clue that would explain the strange occurrence. But each time, the grave was quiet, and no one was around. His heart still raced when he thought about the note. The more he thought about it, the more he felt a sense of unease. Was it possible that someone else was grieving Emily in secret? Had someone else loved her? He couldn't imagine who it could be. Emily had always been close to her family and a small group of friends, but no one had ever seemed to care for her the way he did. Yet the mysterious note didn't feel like it was from a stranger. It felt personal, like the writer understood the depth of his pain. The feeling that someone else was mourning with him haunted him, and that nagging thought kept him coming back to the cemetery, hoping for answers. On one particular evening, a few days after finding the note, Michael decided to visit Emily's grave again. This time, he made a decision. He wouldn't just wait. He would find the person who had been leaving the flowers and the notes. As he approached the cemetery, the air felt colder than usual. The wind whispered through the trees, and a sense of calm settled over him. The cemetery was quiet, just as it had always been, but Michael felt more alert this time. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the rows of gravestones. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, but as he reached Emily's grave, his heart skipped a beat. A figure was standing near it. The person was facing away from him, standing still, with their hands gently resting by their sides. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected anyone to be here, let alone someone so mysterious. He took a few cautious steps forward, not wanting to startle the person. As he got closer, he recognized the silhouette. A woman, dressed in a dark coat, her hair hidden beneath a hood. Something about her posture seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. Before he could call out to her, the woman slowly turned around. When she faced him, Michael's stomach dropped. It was Claire, Emily's best friend from childhood. Michael had almost forgotten about her. He hadn't seen Claire in years, but there she was, standing at Emily's grave, looking as though she had never left. Claire? Michael's voice was hesitant, unsure if he was seeing things correctly. Claire's face softened with a mix of sadness and surprise. "Michael," she said quietly, almost as if she hadn't expected to see him there. I didn't know you'd be here." Michael's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Claire hadn't been a regular part of their lives in recent years. She and Emily had kept in touch, but they hadn't seen each other much after Emily and Michael got married. Yet, here she was, standing at Emily's grave, alone. "What are you doing here, Claire?" Michael asked, his voice more anxious than he intended. Claire glanced down at the ground for a moment before looking back up at him. "I've been coming here for a while," she said softly. "I didn't know how to tell you, Michael, but I've been leaving the flowers and the notes." Michael's heart pounded. "You? But why? Why didn't you tell me?" Claire took a deep breath, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I didn't want to make things harder for you. I know how much you loved Emily, and I didn't want you to think I was overstepping my boundaries. But after she passed, I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. She was my best friend. She meant everything to me, too." Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. "I never knew," Michael whispered, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. "I didn't know you were still so close to her." Claire nodded. "We may have grown apart, but Emily was always in my heart. I've been coming here every week, just trying to remember the good times, trying to keep her spirit alive. And I thought, maybe if I left you a message, you wouldn't feel so alone." We both lost her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. Michael realized that he wasn't the only one left with a broken heart. Emily had meant something different to everyone who knew her, but her loss had left a hole in all their lives. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone who understood," Michael said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. "Thank you for being here." Claire gave him a small, understanding smile. "We're both grieving, Michael. But maybe we can help each other heal." The air around them seemed to shift, and for the first time in months, Michael felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in his grief after all. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to carry the burden by himself. Over the next few weeks, Michael and Claire continued to meet at the cemetery. Every time they saw each other, the conversations grew deeper and their bond grew stronger. They shared stories of Emily, laughed about old memories, and cried together. Both of them had been carrying their grief in silence, and now they had each other to lean on. For Michael, it was a relief to know that someone else understood the pain he felt every single day. But there was something else Claire wanted to tell Michael, something she had been keeping secret. She had been investigating Emily's death. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Emily had been healthy, and everything had seemed normal during her pregnancy. So why had she suddenly died so suddenly? Why hadn't the doctors done more to save her? One evening, after they had spent a few hours talking and reminiscing, Claire finally spoke up. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you. I've been looking into what happened to Emily," she said, her voice steady but full of concern. Michael froze. "What do you mean? You've been investigating?" Claire nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't accept that she just died. It didn't make sense to me. She was young, healthy, and excited to become a mother. And then, it was all taken away in an instant." Michael's heart sank. He had never thought about the possibility that Emily's death wasn't just a tragic accident. He had accepted it as a part of life, something that couldn't be changed. But now, hearing Claire's words, doubt crept into his mind. "What did you find?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I started by looking at the medical records. I went to the hospital where Emily was treated. I wanted to know if there were any signs, anything that could explain why things went so wrong." Michael's mind raced. He had never considered looking at the hospital records. What could she have found? Was it possible that someone had made a mistake? Or worse, had someone caused her death? "I don't know for sure, but there are inconsistencies," Claire said, her voice shaking. "The reports don't add up. The timing of things doesn't make sense, and there are gaps in the records where things should have been noted." Michael stared at Claire in disbelief. He had trusted the doctors, believing that they had done everything they could to save Emily. But now he wasn't so sure. Could it have been a mistake? Michael asked, his voice low. Claire nodded. "That's what I thought at first. But then I found something even more troubling. There was a pattern with some of the doctors, especially one in particular. His name is Dr. Harris. He's been involved in several malpractice cases in the past, but they were all covered up. I don't think Emily's death was an accident. I think something went wrong during her treatment, and the hospital tried to hide it." Michael's stomach twisted as the words sank in. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The thought that someone could have caused Emily's death, whether by negligence or something more sinister, was unbearable. "How do you know this?" Michael asked, his voice growing more urgent. "I spoke to a few people, and I did some digging on my own," Claire explained. "Dr. Harris has a reputation for making mistakes, and I found out that the hospital has been covering up incidents like this for years. They've been protecting him." Michael felt a wave of anger rush over him. He had trusted the doctors, trusted the hospital, but now it seemed like they had failed Emily. The thought that they might have been responsible for her death, and that they had tried to cover it up, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know what to do with this information," Claire said, her voice full of frustration. "But I can't just sit by and let them get away with it. Emily deserves justice." Michael's heart was heavy with a mixture of grief and rage. He wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew Claire was right. There was something wrong with the way things had been handled. Emily deserved to know the truth, and so did he. "We have to do something," Michael said, his voice firm. "We can't let them get away with this. Emily's death can't be swept under the rug." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We will find out the truth, and we'll make sure the people responsible are held accountable." The weight of what they were about to undertake settled on Michael's shoulders. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose. Emily's death had left him broken, but now he had a mission. He wasn't going to let her memory fade into silence. He would fight for the truth, for Emily, and for the justice she deserved. The days after Michael and Claire's conversation felt like they were moving in slow motion. They both knew that the road ahead was not going to be easy, but they also knew it was something they couldn't walk away from. Emily deserved the truth, and they would do whatever it took to find it. Michael's grief, though still present, began to shift into something more focused. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a purpose. The first step was gathering more information. Claire had already done some digging, but there was still so much they didn't know. Michael wasn't sure where to start, but Claire's determination gave him the strength to keep going. Together, they began to piece together the puzzle of Emily's death. They started by reaching out to the people who had been at the hospital the night Emily passed away. Some of the staff had already moved on, but others were still there, and some were willing to talk. At first, Michael was nervous. What if they didn't believe him? What if they didn't take them seriously? But Claire's presence gave him the confidence to keep pushing forward. They contacted a nurse who had been working the night Emily was admitted. Her name was Sarah, and she was hesitant to speak at first. But when she saw the pain in Michael's eyes, she softened. Sarah told them that she had been there when Emily arrived at the hospital, but she wasn't part of the team that had handled her care. However, Sarah remembered one detail clearly. Dr. Harris had been in charge that night. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "But now that I think about it, I remember that Dr. Harris seemed a little distracted, like he wasn't fully focused. It was almost as if he was rushing through the process, like he had other things on his mind." Michael's heart sank. The more he heard, the more it seemed like something had gone wrong that night. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but it was still hard to believe that Dr. Harris could be responsible for Emily's death. Michael had to know more. Claire had been doing her own research, and she had found something troubling. Dr. Harris had been the subject of multiple complaints in the past. It wasn't just one mistake or oversight. There was a pattern. The hospital had done everything it could to protect him, but it seemed that more and more people were speaking up about his behavior. "I think we need to talk to others who worked with him that night," Claire suggested. "Maybe they saw something that we didn't. We need more evidence." Michael agreed. The next step was to talk to the doctors who had been on the same shift as Dr. Harris. They started reaching out to people who had worked at the hospital that night, hoping that someone would be willing to speak out. It wasn't easy. Some of the doctors were defensive, unwilling to talk about what had happened. Others were more open, but their words were careful. Michael could sense that they were afraid of speaking out, but they were also afraid of the truth coming to light. After several days of calls, they finally found someone who was willing to share what they knew. It was a junior doctor, still new to the hospital, who had been assisting Dr. Harris that night. He had seen things that didn't sit right with him, but had been too afraid to speak up at the time. "I don't know if this helps," the junior doctor said, nervously shifting in his seat. "But I remember there was a moment when Dr. Harris seemed distracted while Emily was in labor. He left the room several times to take phone calls, and he seemed frustrated. I didn't understand why he wasn't more focused on her care." Michael's heart raced. This was it. This was the piece of the puzzle he had been looking for. Emily's life had been in Dr. Harris' hands, and instead of focusing on saving her, he had been distracted by something else. The thought was devastating. "That's when it all started to go wrong, isn't it?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. He wasn't paying attention. He didn't do his job. The junior doctor nodded. "I didn't want to believe it, but looking back, I think Emily was let down. I think something went wrong, and Dr. Harris didn't take it seriously. I'm so sorry." Michael felt the weight of those words settle on him. This wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a series of mistakes and missteps, ones that had cost Emily her life. The guilt that had been consuming him began to shift, replaced by a burning desire for justice. "I'll make sure people know what happened," Michael said, his voice firm. "I'm going to make sure no one forgets Emily." He and Claire both knew that exposing the truth wasn't going to be easy. It would take time, effort, and a lot of courage. But they were ready. Emily deserved to have her story told, and they would stop at nothing to make sure her voice was heard. Michael and Claire knew that exposing the truth about Emily's death wouldn't be easy. They had uncovered some troubling information, but they still needed more evidence to take action. They were determined to find it, no matter how long it took. The weight of their mission was heavy, but they both felt a deep responsibility to Emily's memory. They couldn't rest until they knew the truth was known. Their first step was to gather as much information as possible. They started speaking to more people who had been in the hospital the night Emily passed away. Michael and Claire were relentless in their pursuit of the truth. They even contacted other patients who had been treated by Dr. Harris around the same time as Emily. It wasn't easy, but every new person they spoke to seemed to confirm their suspicions. Dr. Harris had a history of being careless, distracted, and unprofessional. Then they received a breakthrough. A former nurse who had worked with Dr. Harris reached out to them. She had heard about their investigation and wanted to help. Her name was Karen, and she had worked at the hospital for several years before leaving due to personal reasons. She was reluctant to speak at first, but after hearing Michael's story, she felt that it was the right thing to do. "I've seen Dr. Harris do things that made me uncomfortable," Karen confessed, her voice low and full of hesitation. "I didn't think it was my place to say anything back then, but now, after hearing about Emily, I feel like I need to speak out." Karen told them that Dr. Harris had been under pressure for months. There were rumors about his behavior, how he was always rushing through procedures and not paying attention to details. Karen herself had witnessed him make several mistakes in the past, but the hospital had always brushed it under the rug. When she started noticing more and more mistakes, she decided to leave the hospital for good. "There were moments when I saw things happening that made me worry about the care patients were getting," Karen said, tears in her eyes. "But I didn't know how to speak up. The hospital didn't make it easy to report problems, and Dr. Harris was so well connected. He always seemed to get away with everything." Her testimony was the final piece of the puzzle. Now Michael and Claire had the evidence they needed to take action. The truth was out there, and they were determined to make sure it was heard. But they knew that getting justice for Emily wasn't going to be as simple as telling their story. The next step was to contact a lawyer. Michael and Claire knew they needed legal help to move forward with the case. They couldn't do it alone. They reached out to a lawyer named Sarah, who had experience with medical malpractice cases. Sarah was sympathetic to their cause and agreed to help them file a lawsuit against the hospital. It was a daunting task, but Sarah was confident that they had enough evidence to build a strong case. "We're going to make sure this hospital is held accountable," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "It's time for the truth to come out, and if they think they can hide it, they're wrong." Michael and Claire felt a wave of relief. They had come so far, and now they had the support they needed to see this through. But there was still a long road ahead. The hospital would fight back. They would have to deal with lawyers, paperwork, and endless hours of research. It was going to be exhausting, but Michael couldn't turn back now. He was doing this for Emily. He was doing this for their child, who would never know their mother. Weeks passed, and the legal process moved slowly. But with each day, Michael and Claire grew more determined. They had learned so much, and now they were taking action. The more they learned, the more they realized how much was at stake. This wasn't just about Emily. It was about ensuring that no other family had to suffer the same fate. They wanted to change the system, to make sure that doctors like Dr. Harris couldn't continue to put patients at risk. Finally, the day came when the lawsuit was filed. Michael couldn't believe it. It felt like such a huge step forward. But it was also terrifying. He knew that the hospital would fight tooth and nail to protect their reputation. They had the resources to bury the truth. But Michael wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and that gave him the strength to keep going. The court hearings began soon after, and the hospital's defense team worked hard to discredit the evidence. They tried to paint Dr. Harris as an innocent man who had made a simple mistake, but Michael and Claire weren't giving up. They presented the testimony of the nurse, the junior doctor, and the former hospital staff. The pieces were all falling into place. Slowly, the truth was starting to come out. The hospital could no longer hide behind their excuses. They could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. As the legal battle continued, Michael and Claire felt the pressure weighing on them. The court hearings had become more intense, and the stakes were higher than ever. They knew the hospital's legal team would fight fiercely to protect Dr. Harris and their reputation. But Michael and Claire had one thing the hospital didn't: the truth. And with every new piece of evidence, they were one step closer to seeing justice done. The days in court were long and exhausting. Michael had never imagined that pursuing justice for Emily would be such a difficult journey. The lawyers for the hospital were skilled at twisting the facts and trying to make it seem like Dr. Harris was just a well-meaning doctor who had made an honest mistake. But Michael knew better. He had heard the testimonies. He had seen the evidence. Dr. Harris had been negligent, and the hospital had covered up his mistakes to protect him. Claire, too, was feeling the strain of the case. It wasn't just the emotional toll of reliving the painful memories of Emily's death. It was the constant pressure of watching the hospital's defense try to discredit everything they had worked so hard to uncover. But every time the defense tried to twist the facts, Claire found a way to fight back. She was determined to stand by Michael and ensure that Emily's story was heard. One day, as they prepared for another court session, Michael found himself standing outside the courtroom, taking a deep breath. He had been through so much already, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There were moments when he questioned whether they were really going to win this battle, or if the hospital's power and influence would be enough to keep them from succeeding. "Are you okay?" Claire's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She had come to stand next to him, offering him a small but reassuring smile. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "It's just so hard. I want to believe we're going to win, but it feels like they have so many resources at their disposal. I just keep thinking that maybe we're not enough." Claire put a hand on his shoulder. "We are enough," she said firmly. "We've already done more than anyone else ever has. We've uncovered the truth, and we found people who are willing to stand with us. We're not alone in this." Her words gave him a renewed sense of hope. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emily. It was about the baby she would never get to hold. And it was about the other patients who had been failed by Dr. Harris. The thought of those families kept Michael going. He couldn't let Emily's death be in vain. He couldn't let the hospital and its corrupt system continue to hurt people. The next few days were critical. The defense was pulling out all the stops, trying to make Michael and Claire look like they were grasping at straws. But Sarah, their lawyer, had been working tirelessly to prepare their case. She had seen the cracks in the hospital's defense, and she was determined to expose them. In one particularly tense session, Sarah presented a key piece of evidence: an internal email from the hospital's administration, which showed that they had been aware of Dr. Harris' previous mistakes, but had chosen to cover them up. The email was a game changer. It proved that the hospital had actively protected Dr. Harris, despite knowing about his past errors. It was the smoking gun that Michael and Claire had been waiting for. When the email was read aloud in the courtroom, the room fell silent. The hospital's defense team scrambled to explain it away, but the damage had been done. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no hiding it. Michael felt a sense of relief wash over him. The hospital could no longer deny their role in Emily's death. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet, as the court hearings dragged on, Michael couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. They were closer to winning, but there was still a long way to go. Every day in court brought new challenges, new arguments from the defense, and new obstacles to overcome. As the trial continued, more and more people came forward to testify. Nurses, doctors, and former employees all spoke out about Dr. Harris' behavior, describing how the hospital had turned a blind eye to his mistakes. The weight of the truth was growing heavier, and Michael felt a growing sense of hope. They were finally going to get justice for Emily. It wasn't just the legal victory that Michael and Claire were after anymore. They wanted to expose the truth, to make sure that no one else had to suffer because of Dr. Harris's negligence. They wanted to send a message to the hospital and to the world that people's lives were not to be treated like they were expendable. Every day, the fight felt more and more like a mission. The final days of the trial arrived, and Michael felt the weight of everything they had fought for. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as the lawyers made their closing arguments. The hospital's defense team had tried every trick in the book to avoid responsibility. They had blamed everyone but Dr. Harris, but the evidence was undeniable. Michael and Claire had done everything they could to expose the truth. As Sarah, their lawyer, stood up to make her closing argument, Michael's heart pounded. She was about to deliver the final blow to the hospital's defense. She spoke clearly and with confidence, addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen the evidence," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You've heard the testimony of those who worked with Dr. Harris, who witnessed his mistakes, his carelessness, and his lack of focus when he was supposed to be saving lives. You've seen the internal emails, the records, and the patterns of neglect. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a series of failures, a series of choices made by Dr. Harris and the hospital that led to Emily's death, and those choices were avoidable." Michael held his breath as Sarah continued. "What's at stake here isn't just a lawsuit. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that the mistakes made by Dr. Harris are never repeated. It's about making sure that no family has to go through the same pain and suffering that Michael and Claire have endured." She paused, looking directly at the jury. Emily was a mother, a wife, a daughter. She didn't deserve to die because of someone's negligence. Michael didn't deserve to lose his wife, and their unborn child didn't deserve to be robbed of a mother. This case is about justice for them, and for every other person who has been hurt by a system that failed them. As Sarah finished her speech, Michael felt tears welling up in his eyes. He was overwhelmed by the support they had received and the fight they had put up. It had been a long, painful journey, but he knew they had given it everything they had. They had honored Emily's memory, and now it was time to let the jury decide. The jury deliberated for hours. Michael and Claire waited anxiously, not knowing what to expect. The tension in the room was thick. The hospital's legal team remained confident, but Michael could see the cracks in their defense. The truth had come out, and there was no hiding from it now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. Michael's heart raced as the foreman stood up to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs," the foreman said, his voice clear and unwavering. "We hold the hospital and Dr. Harris responsible for the wrongful death of Emily Thompson." The words echoed in Michael's ears. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The truth had won. Justice had been served. The room erupted in a mix of shock and relief. Michael and Claire exchanged a look, and in that moment, everything felt right. They had done it. They had fought for Emily, and they had won. The hospital would now be held accountable for their actions. The hospital was ordered to pay a significant settlement, but for Michael, the victory wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that the hospital could no longer hide behind their lies. The truth was out in the open, and that meant something far more important than any amount of money ever could. As Michael and Claire walked out of the courtroom, they were surrounded by reporters. Michael felt exhausted but proud. He didn't care about the cameras or the questions. They had won. Emily's story had been heard, and the world would know the truth. Later that evening, as Michael stood at Emily's grave, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in months. The weight of the trial had been lifted, and while the pain of losing Emily would never fully go away, he knew that justice had been served. Emily's memory would live on, and the changes they had fought for would help protect others from suffering the same fate. "Emily," Michael whispered, placing a hand on the gravestone. "We did it. We got justice for you, and we'll make sure no one ever forgets you." He stood there for a long time, letting the silence settle around him. He didn't need to say anything else. In his heart, he knew that Emily was watching over them, proud of what they had accomplished. As he turned to leave, Claire joined him, and together they walked away from the cemetery, knowing that they had given everything for the truth. The battle had been hard, but they had won. And in the end, that was all that mattered.